Did you guys watch the documentary? Those of you who are here in the meeting, how many of you watched it? Give me a thumbs up if you watched the documentary. Thank you, Katrina. Jose, Josh?
Yeah, I watched it.
Thank you, Jose. Josh, how about you? You know, and this isn't like, oh my God, you know, you're gonna be in trouble if you didn't do your homework. It's not high school. I just want to know what I'm dealing with here, whether you guys are on the same page as I am. And whether I can talk to you about this or whether we should just move on. Josh, did you watch it? Are you there?
Do you want us to?
Sorry?
Do you want us to like tell you what questions we answered?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, Katrina. If my question isn't clear to you, feel free to ask me to clarify it. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm asking you. That is, if one of the questions you answered, I'm assuming you picked the questions to answer based on the things in the documentary that struck you as important. Does that make sense? And so if you don't want to give me one of the questions that you answered and you just want to talk about something generally you thought was important in the documentary, that's fine. But that's okay, Samantha. Right? But just anything. You can refer to the questions or anything else. And do you guys want to use raise hand? You know that little icon, it's a little blue hand. You guys have it. I think it's in participants. You need to go to participants to raise your hand. That's where it is. So if you're afraid to speak over someone else and that's why you're not responding, we can do raise hand. Do you want me to pose the question again? For those of you who just popped in? Okay, Kendall and Samantha. Was somebody about to speak? I heard someone say Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Katrina.
Can we talk about the question and the chapter 2 one? Why does Y say that colorblindness is not the solution dealing with race?
Would you repeat that? I couldn't quite make it out.
Can you talk about why does Y say that colorblindness is not the solution to dealing with race?
Okay, good. Yes, thank you very much, Katrina, for bringing that up. All right, and that's another good strategy for this conversation that I'm trying to have with you in Zoom, is that if there were things about the documentary that you didn't understand, you can ask me about those and we can clear them up. But what Katrina just asked about, you guys, and for Kendall, Samantha, and Tyne, what I'm asking people to contribute to this discussion is their impressions of the documentary, concepts or ideas or claims made by Wise in the documentary that you thought were important or interesting. And Katrina just asked us to talk about color blindness as an example. Okay, color blindness is a concept that we need to understand for the purposes of analyzing the social construction of race in the US. Does anybody know what color blindness means? What does it mean to be colorblind? If somebody says, I'm colorblind, what do they mean by that?
They can't see certain colors.
Oh, okay, literally. Good. Right? My husband is colorblind. That's so funny. I didn't even think of it that way, but yes, literally that's what it means. Your eyeballs are not capable of seeing the full color spectrum. My husband can kind of see blue, and he can kind of see green, but reds and oranges, that part of the spectrum, he can't really see at all. Mostly it's just black and white for him. But so how does that apply to race, you guys? Not being able to see color or claiming that you don't.
Like,
I don't see color. You might hear
like
people.
not being able to see race itself, and like if you see someone that's black, you'd be like, oh, like I don't see it, but it's kind of just like an excuse.
Yeah, right. What you're trying to, what one who says they are colorblind is trying to say is that the color of people doesn't matter to them, right? Last week I said, race isn't a real thing. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But, race has to do, is a social construct, right? Which means our ideas about race are things that we make up, right? And our ideas about race have to do with what we think the color of a person's skin means. Usually that is the racial marker, right? A person's skin tone, their complexion is a main one. There are others, right? The shape of their eyes, right? Their size, okay? There are different physical markers of race, but the biggest one is skin color, it's complexion. Would you guys agree with me? How do you know what race a person is? You look at them and you observe their skin color. Samantha says, yes, facial features, like Asian people, right? Asian people have eyes that are shaped in a certain way versus people who are not Asian, okay? And then there's a wide range of skin tones within, that particular subgroup, that racial group of Asian, okay? But these are the physical markers that we identify as meaning something about race, right? And then we decide what that means about the person. Okay, we talked a little bit about this last week when we were discussing implicit bias and stereotypes. You guys remember that? What's implicit bias?
In the film, it talked about how they were like thoughts, like random thoughts or reactions that you get without meaning to have them. It's kind of just like a little, I guess, in a sense, like a lack of judgment.
Yeah, or it's an unawareness that a judgment is being made. Does that make sense, Samantha? You're not aware of the biases that are implicit. They're unconscious. Thank you for that thumbs up, letting me know you understand. So that's the key word for understanding the concept of implicit bias is unconscious. And you guys all know what biases are, right? What's a bias? Excuse me, I have the sniffles. I've had allergies for weeks, pardon me. What's a bias, you guys? Didn't we talk about this last week? Go ahead, Kendall, sorry.
Yeah, I'd say a bias is like a skewed opinion, maybe, that it like leans more towards like someone's personal opinion or like just one side of the situation.
Yes, you used two good ways to summarize what bias means. You said skewed, right? Slanted is another way. If anybody in here is a makes clothes or sews or works with fabric,
Mm-hmm.
you know that there's a bias in fabric, and that's the grain of the fabric, right? If you pull along the bias, it doesn't stretch. If you pull against the bias, it stretches. But it's a slant, right? A particular attitude that you have towards something. Okay? And as students, you probably know that you should not be biased when you're making arguments about something. You need to address both sides of the debate. If you don't, then that's biased, right? Because you're just favoring one or the other side. Okay? So implicit biases are those biases that we're not aware we have, that we learned them really young, right? Usually that's how they become implicit, because these things are installed in us like a program from very young, right? And then we just carry on as if they're part of nature. And we talked about this when we were talking about gender construction too, right? The ideas that we have about gender and what gender means. And if you're a girl, what that means. And if you're a boy, what that means, and how we tell if a person is a girl or a boy. right? The same thing applies to race, okay? And the implicit biases that we have about race are things that are installed in us, usually from very young. And, you know, they're based on things that the culture, and there are different facets of our culture, right? There's the broader culture, which includes the media. And then there's our microculture, which is our families and our neighborhoods, right? That's a part of culture too. And in all of these different facets of culture, we are being taught from a very young age what race means. And then those ideas about what race means get installed in our brains, and we forget they're there. And then we act on them. Okay, so that's implicit bias. And then from that, excuse me, we develop stereotypes. All right, so we'll come back to colorism, Katrina, or color blindness, excuse me. Colorism is a different thing. We'll come back to color blindness. All right, but from implicit bias, we develop stereotypes. And you guys all know what stereotypes are, right? I feel like we talked about this a little bit last week. So somebody just summarize, what's a stereotype for me? Maybe that was my other class, but I think I talked to you guys about this last week too.
A stereotype? I think it's like kind of assuming how someone is based on like what they do or look like.
Yeah. And so there are different kinds of stereotypes, right, Kendall? There are gender ones. There are stereotypes that we have about gender. There are stereotypes we have about age.
Yeah.
Right? And there are stereotypes we have about race. So we'll call those racial stereotypes. Josh says a generalization, okay, about a group of people. If we're talking about stereotypes that we have about human beings, then we're overgeneralizing about groups of people. And if we're talking about racial stereotypes, then we're overgeneralizing about groups of people based on their race or what we perceive their race to be. All right, and so stereotypes are derived from our implicit biases, aren't they? They're the conscious mental pictures that we have. So it's kind of, I like to think of this as degrees of consciousness. Implicit biases are the things that we take for granted as being true about people, but we're not aware of it, okay? And then stereotypes are more specific assumptions that we make about an entire group of people based on some superficial characteristic that they have, okay? And racial stereotypes are based on race, based on our perceptions of a person's race, right? Give me some examples of racial stereotypes, you guys. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to look for a piece of paper so I can write some things down while I'm talking to you, so I don't forget what the hell I was saying. Okay, it's not a good week. It's better than last week, but still problematic. Hang on. Okay, here's my paper. Okay, so I was just asking you, what are some specific stereotypes? And Samantha says Asian kids are academically gifted. Yes. In what specific area, Samantha? In all areas? Math, right? Or science, technology, engineering, right? The STEM fields. And Gup writes about this. That's what Gup writes about. Samantha says African Americans are good in sports, right? Just naturally, okay? They're just naturally gifted to be better at sports. And Asian kids are naturally gifted. It's in their biology. It's in their bodies, okay? And, you know, hopefully this is triggering some memories of our conversations about gender and the difference between culture and nature in determining what that means. Thank you, Annie. What does gender mean? What does race mean? Okay, our stereotypes are grounded in assumptions that we make about a person's nature. Okay, what their bodies can do, what their brains as part of their body can do. right? And if we say African Americans are good at sports, then the corollary is, and they're not very good at thinking, right? Asian people are better at thinking than Black or brown people are. Is that, you guys with me on that? As a stereotype. Again, present company accepted with an E. Okay, none of us here believe these things to be true, at least not consciously. But we all have them, don't we? We all have these stereotypes in our minds. So that, you know, if we ever get back into a classroom together, right? And there are some Asian kids in that classroom, okay? The majority of people who are not Asian in that classroom are going to assume that the Asian kid or kids are smart, right? That they're good at school, they're good at academics, right? Do you guys agree? Have you ever thought that about someone? I can't see you, but I don't believe there are any Asian people just based on your names in this meeting. I have some Asian people in my other classes. And we've talked about this. Have you guys thought that about people who are Asian? That they're just naturally academically gifted? Give me a thumbs up if you've thought that. And I did say present company accepted, right? But I just want to identify these things in ourselves, right? And thank you, Samantha. And part of the reason I want to do that is just to highlight once again, thank you, Katrina, that this is not about good or bad people, right? This is not about whether you're a good person or a bad person. This is about culture and cultural influence that we're not often even aware of. And that's the implicit bias. Okay, so implicit bias leads to stereotypes. Okay, and those are overgeneralizations that we make about people based on their race when we're talking about racial ones. All right, and they're problematic, right? As Ortiz, Kofer, and Gupp explain, all stereotypes are problematic, right? Because what does Gupp say is his biggest problem with stereotypes, even positive ones?
He says that they cause an issue for individuality.
Yeah, that's the biggest problem, is that they deny people. Stereotypes of dumb blondes. Thank you, Annie, right? That is an anti-feminist stereotype. Feminist and racial stereotype, right? That white women with blonde hair aren't very smart. It's ridiculous. You know, we all know blonde people who are super intelligent and people with dark hair who aren't as so intelligent or seem to not be that intelligent. Okay, I don't even know where that stereotype came from. But anyway, so yeah, I forget what I was talking about. Oh my God, I totally lost my train of thought. Do you guys remember the heck I was talking about? Drink some more coffee. Anyway, so implicit bias leads to stereotype, overgeneralization. The problem with that is for individuality. Okay, people not being treated as individuals, but being treated as part of a group and having the same characteristics as everybody else in that group, just because of how they look. All right, and Gupp says that's a problem because his kids, aren't very good at math, or one of them is, but how did one of his kids get to be good at math, you guys? His two adopted Korean children. One of them, he says, is good at math.
He talks about how David has disabilities, like learning disabilities, and it's not because of his like race that he's good in school. It's because he puts in the effort and the time.
Yeah. So two problems with any kind of stereotype, even positive ones, is that it erases individuals, right? It lumps them into a group and homogenizes them. And then they don't get credit for their hard work. Right, you guys? that it just erases the hard work that goes into academic success. If you say to someone, oh, you're good at that because it's just in your nature. And we know there are important cultural differences that account for why, you know, Asian students excel. Because that's true, right, you guys? That just statistically Asian students excel in the STEM fields. That's a fact, isn't it, you guys? But then, thank you, Samantha. But then, thank you, Josh. But then we decide what that fact means, right? And that's where the stereotyping comes in. It's the ideas we have about race and what it means, the things that we observe, that we attribute to someone's nature, right? When we shouldn't, okay? At least not because of their race, alrighty? Asians are academically not gifted, but they're academically successful because of their culture, because they value education highly and they work really, really hard at it. And the whole family is in there pushing, okay, the students to excel and expecting excellence and demanding it. Right, you guys? All righty, so has nothing to do with their bodies. All right, so we talked about implicit bias. We talked about stereotypes. All right. And let's go back to color blindness, because color blindness is a response that people who want to be perceived as good people have to all of these aspects of racial construction in our society. Are you with me, Katrina, so far? Since you raised the question about color blindness. Okay, so color blindness is something that people who are trying to be good people say, that color doesn't mean anything. Your race doesn't matter to me, right? I don't see your race. I just see you as an individual, right? Is there a problem with that, you guys? What's a problem with color blindness? Or people who claim to be colorblind?
People like stop trying to deal with like the issue of racism and pretend that it's just like cured and like it's like a thing of the past.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're a white person and you're dealing with a person of color, okay, who is a friend or an acquaintance, or you know, somebody that you like and somebody that, you know, you want to treat fairly, and you say, you know what, I don't see your color, you know, that person isn't going to necessarily be happy about that. Right? They're going to say, and Josh says a lot of people's identity has to do with their race. That's another thing, right? So being colorblind is a way of erasing something about that person that is for them important. That your race doesn't matter to me. And they're like, geez, my race matters to me, right? There's a lot about the thing that I think of as race that is part of my identity that's important to me. Okay, so you're just going to ignore that and pretend like it doesn't matter when it does. And then the other thing to pick up on what Tan was saying is that there are real problems that people in our society experience because of the way they are treated based on other people's perceptions of race and what it means. For you to say race doesn't matter to me isn't helpful, because it matters a lot to them in their lives. And if we say it doesn't matter, then what we're also saying subtextually is that we don't want to talk about it or deal with it. Does that make sense, you guys? Thank you, Katrina and Samantha, for your thumbs up. Okay, Time, thank you, Annie. Jose and Josh, does that make sense to you? The issue with color blindness? As a well-meaning attempt on the part of people who think of themselves that way, to just get over, you know, the issue of race and its material effects. There's that phrase again that I like to use, the material effects of the way we construct race in our society. I've said a couple times race isn't a real thing, and it's not. And I'll talk to you about that in just a second. but it does have real consequences for people's lives because of the way that we construct it in our society, and then the way people are treated as a result. So for us to just say that we're colorblind, that doesn't help solve the problem. We're not going to fix anything that we refuse to look at and talk about and work on. Okay, let me shift gears to sharing. Anything else about, thank you, Katrina, for that very productive question. We got to talk about a lot of different concepts that I need to talk with you about today because you asked that question. Are there any other parts of White Like Me that you guys would like to discuss? We'll be coming back to it. Anything else that stood out for you in that documentary that you answered a question about or didn't? Yeah, so Jose is contributing to the conversation about color blindness. He says, a person's skin color affects that person's lifestyle. And that's why it's not positive to be colorblind, right? Thank you, Jose. It affects the life that they're having. And if you tell them that you're not going to pay attention to that, then, you know, essentially what you're telling them or what they're hearing, even though you don't mean it, is that you don't care about the things that they're experiencing because of their race. Somebody else was going to answer my question about White Like Me, the documentary. Other things that stood out to you? I saw a box light up. Jose said, I find it interesting how white people can't really determine their culture. That's a good one. All right, because some of the people who were interviewed for this documentary, that's what they said, right? They said that they don't feel like they have a culture. And they sort of feel sad about that, right? They feel sad that they don't have a cultural identity of their own, or they don't feel that they do. But that's a pretty, what's the word? That's a pretty complex concept, right? Do you guys want to dig into it? Yeah, let's do it. Let's go ahead. All right, why do you guys think that white people don't feel like they have a culture? Why is there no White History Day, you guys,
I
in
feel
the
like
US? And we're talking about the US. Go ahead, Josh.
I feel like white is just like the reason when you say like specifically if you ask like a white kid like as a white person what's your culture, I feel like that's just so broad of a question because at the end of the day, like, well, in America, white has been generalized as like one thing. Like, you, as a white person, you can be Irish, Greek, European, like anything. You can be a Spaniard and be pretty pale, and a lot of people think you're white. So I feel like a lot of people don't know their background. And like, for me, I feel like when I was younger, I kind of felt that way. But as I got older, like, I found out how much Irish I had in me. And I started to talk to my mom about that a bit. And like, since that, I don't know, I've definitely found like more identity in my race to some extent. Whereas like you can find culture, like Irish culture is like not a boring thing. There's like a lot to Irish culture, but a lot of people don't know what they are. They just think, oh, I'm white. What's white? Like people just think of America when they think white. But the truth is like a lot of these white people came from other places too. Like specifically Irish people, a lot of people came from like famines and stuff like that. And like they were refugees from Ireland and stuff. So I feel like you just kind of have to figure out what your actual background is, and then you can kind of start to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's some very deep history, right, to the Americanization of Irish immigrants, which we don't have time to go into right now, right? But how do you guys know anything about this history of Irish immigration to the US? How were they treated when they first arrived in this country? Anybody know?
Bad?
They were treated badly. Good guess, Katrina. Yeah, they were treated really badly, right? They were treated as if they were just one step above Black people, right? Just one step above Black people. Not quite Black, but really, you know, second-class citizens. Not even citizens, right? There were signs all around that said, no Irish need apply, that you couldn't, you know, they were being discriminated against, okay, on the basis of their perceived race, right? And now, you know, Irish culture has just pretty much been assimilated into American culture, right? And American is the normative, right? And what color is coded American, you guys? Do you understand my question? What skin tone is coded American?
White.
That's it. So whites don't have, okay, any distinct culture that they think about because it's the normative culture, right? And the individual cultures that people we now think of as white in this country, right, were just sort of erased. They were assimilated into a broader American culture. But I have Latino students who refer to white people as American when they're writing to me and talking to me. And I said, do you mean white? They're like, yeah, but American, right? And that's unconscious. They're not even aware that they're doing that, right? Because whiteness is the default. So we don't think about it. Does that make sense, you guys? It's the norm for American culture. So and identity. So we don't think about it, right? Also, there's a history of the whiteification of European immigrants, all of whom, by the way, Italians too, when they came to this country, right, were ostracized. Because you guys, the British didn't like the Italians, right, or the Spanish when they were in Europe. They used to look down on those people. Get this, as being too passionate and not being intellectual enough, right, and not being very civilized. All of those racially coded assumptions that we make about people because of the way, because of their culture that we attach to race, right? British people had, and French people had. Well, British people had those ideas about the French, that the French are just, they're not, you know, they're not as civilized as we are. They're kind of barbarians. But when all of those people, because of their skin tone, came to the US, then over time, they slowly became part of the same racial identity. Does that make sense? So that's how people, that's why in the documentary, they say white people don't feel like they have their own culture because they don't really have to think about it. It's just the norm. Okay, and right now it's consumer culture. The consumerism is really what's taken over. Okay, Anglo-American culture is consumer culture. All right. All right, anything else about the documentary that stood out to you guys that you thought was important before we move on to other things? Okay, we're going to talk about things like institutional racism, which is something that Wise talks a lot about in his documentary. He talks about the GI Bill, right? And how it was designed on purpose to exclude Black people. Do you guys remember that? Part of the documentary, the GI Bill, and other aspects of the New Deal, okay, which was an attempt on the part of our federal government to help people get back on their feet after a world war, to help people get a home, right? To give people health care, to give people financial security, all right? So Social Security, Medicare, or Medicare, the GI Bill. GI stands for General Infantry. So if you were a veteran, then that would give you access to low interest loans so you could buy a house. Do you guys remember this part of the documentary? No? Okay, thank you, Annie. And how did it work, Annie? How did the GI Bill work? What were the rules? And Samantha, either one of you. you remember what the rules were for the GI Bill? Who could use it?
So I'm just looking at my notes. I put that it provided many benefits for vets. So low cost more loans for business.
Mortgages, yeah, for
Yeah.
homes.
Yeah, cash payments for tuition and living expenses. And then it did not protect Black vets that qualified, so it was like legal discrimination.
Hmm. Yeah, and do you remember how it excluded Black people from receiving those benefits, even if they were veterans?
They excluded a lot of jobs that were mainly occupied by African Americans.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. Do you remember, anybody remember what those specific jobs were?
They were agricultural jobs and domestic.
Right, right, Jose? Agriculture and domestic, is that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, good, thank you, you too. Yeah. So, so who was working in the fields, right, picking crops in the 50s, you guys? What people were doing that? Were white people doing that?
No.
Mostly
No.
not. Some were, but mostly not. Black people were doing that, right? Poor white people and Black people. Thank you, Deborah. Yes. And then who was working in the home, taking care of people's children and cleaning their houses? That's domestic. What kind of people were doing those jobs? Thank you, Annie. Yeah, special bonuses for vets. And mostly white ones, right? Who was doing that work, you guys? Who was working in the home, taking care of people's children and cleaning their houses back in those days? Mostly. Usually women. What kind of women? Black women. Thank you, Debbie. Okay, Black women were doing those jobs. So they were excluded from receiving these benefits on purpose. Do you remember how Wise explained that? He said, this is what the Democrats who were pushing this legislation needed to do in order to get it passed. Okay, because there were, Southern legislators who would refuse, okay, to vote for this legislation if Black people were going to receive these benefits. Okay, so they didn't come right out in the rules and say, no Black people can get this. But they managed to exclude most Black people by excluding those jobs. And I don't know what the rationale was for excluding those jobs, or even if they made an attempt to give one. Okay, but it was on purpose, you guys, to discriminate against Black people. And then, the outcome of that, okay, decades later, right, is a wealth gap between, Black families and white families. The wealth gap is huge. All right, and a lot of middle-class people were able in the 50s to start building family wealth by buying a home, right? And buying a home is like having a bank account. Do you guys understand this? It's an asset that you own and in which there is equity. There's cash value in a person's home when they own it, and they can draw on that like a bank account. All right, and then they can pass it on to their kids. Right, so you can see that the generational wealth gap that we see now between Black and white families, right, has its basis in historic institutional discrimination, institutional racism. So that's another important concept. We talked about color blindness. We talked about implicit bias. We talked about stereotypes, all right? And we're talking about institutional racism, which is another super important concept that we need to have a shared understanding of in order to do this project. That there's a difference between personal racism, individual racism, and institutional racism, where the discrimination is built into our systems. What are some other institutions, you guys? Give me some examples of institutions. Colleges, education is an institution. Banks, okay? The financial sector is an institution. And discrimination has been documented, right, in lending, in banks, in the lending practices of banks. They discriminate, okay? They decide who they're going to give loans to and who they're not based on their implicit bias about race and gender, but these things have been documented, that they're much more willing to give loans to white men, okay, and women, but mostly white men, than they are any people of color, because of the implicit bias they have about people of color, right? Banks are making decisions based on risk assessment when they make decisions about to whom to loan money, right? You guys understand that? What do I mean by that? Banks make decisions about risk. Anybody know? Right? If you go for a loan, okay, you need to apply for the loan and you need to tell them what your income is, right? Whether you can pay it back on time. Thank you, Debbie. That's what they're assessing. And Annie says, depending on if there's money going to be spent wisely or not, right? And if that money will be paid back, right? The lenders, they want to make money on their loan. They charge interest to make money. That's why they do it. They don't do it because they're nice. It's a business, right? And if you don't pay your loan back, then they lose. Samantha says it's if you're reliable and financially stable. Good, right? So they have implicit bias about race that plays into their risk assessment when people go to them to apply for a loan. And the implicit bias they have about race is that Black and brown people aren't going to pay back their loans. They're not a good risk. All right, and you know, it's been documented that you know, a person seeking a loan who's Black goes into a bank and applies for the loan and has the same qualifications as a person who's white applying for the same loan. And the person who's white gets it and the person who's Black doesn't. This is well documented. People have done sting operations on banks to assess discrimination and have found it to be rampant. Okay, and in lending for homes as well. We were talking about institutional racism with respect to the GI Bill as playing a part in the wealth that a family is able to accrue and then hand down to descendants, creating a wealth gap between Black and white families that persists to this day, you guys. So let me give you an example, okay? I don't know if you guys remember, but I think I told you that my father went to prison when I was 6. Okay, my white father went to prison when I was 6 years old. And on marijuana charges, right? And he got 5 to life in the 60s, you guys. Yeah, and now it's legal. So, but that's another story. But anyway, he went to prison. He was a felon. He was convicted of a felony and he went to prison. And we got some good lawyers and with help from friends, and he was released on parole after serving about 1.5 years, right? And then for another year or so, we were on welfare, and he sort of, you know, bounced around in jobs. But eventually, because he had connections, he was able to get a job working for Los Angeles County that paid really well. And also, he's a veteran. My dad fought in the Korean War. So he was able to use his GI Bill benefits to go to college for free, okay, and buy a home, okay, to get a job, even though he was a convicted felon, right? Buy a home and go to college and buy a home. And from that one home, he bought this home in Manhattan Beach, California in the 70s. Anybody know where that is? Okay, there are $1 million homes in that city now. It's a suburb of Los Angeles. It's in LA County. Manhattan Beach. And from that one home, he used the equity to buy another home. My parents did. They were both working, right? And then they used the equity in that, and they rented that one. Then they used the equity in that home to buy another home, all right? And they built up their wealth that way. They built up their wealth by being able to draw on the GI Bill to buy a home and then parlay that equity into another home and another one. And in addition to that, to buy a home in a location that was going to appreciate like crazy. Okay? My parents, the first home they bought, they paid $30,000 for in Manhattan Beach. Okay, that one was east of Sepulveda. Then they bought another home west of Sepulveda in an even better location, closer to the beach. All right, and that home is worth like $3 million now, you guys. They paid $83,000 for it. You see how this works? Everybody with me? So I'm going to get that eventually. All right. Meanwhile, an acquaintance of mine, a Black person whose family, his parents were law enforcement officers. One worked for the LAPD, one worked for the LA County Sheriff's Department, both Black. You know, they bought a home, they bought their first home, and they had really good jobs with really good income, better than my parents. My parents worked for the county as social workers, okay? These two cops made much more money than my parents, but they were able to buy a home in Inglewood, California. Anybody know where that is? Give me a thumbs up if you've heard of Inglewood. By the Forum, yes, Debbie, by the Forum, thank you. Right, it's about 8 miles from Manhattan Beach, Inglewood. Okay, it's in the pathway of LAX. It's in the flight path of LAX, so it's kind of noisy, right? And a bunch of, once the Black people started to move in, the white people left and the property values dropped. Okay, so I told you guys that my parents' home is worth several $1 million now, the Manhattan Beach home on west of Sepulveda. Okay, this acquaintance's family home is worth about $700,000. Do you see the difference, you guys? And they have not been able to parlay the way my parents did, the equity in their home into other real estate. My parents are real estate moguls. Minor league, but still. Does that make sense? That's institutional racism and its effects. Does it make sense, you guys? I can't see you, so I don't know if you're getting any of this. Give me a thumbs up if you understood all the crap that just came out of my mouth. Thank you. Thank you, two of you. Yes, thank you, Annie. Okay, so we talked about implicit bias. We talked about stereotypes, okay? We've talked about colorblindness and institutional racism, okay? All from the documentary. How much time do I have? Ooh, I have a little bit of time. And you guys are supposed to get into groups today. All right, so maybe I'll do this with you next week. All right, so you can get into groups. Or maybe not, maybe I'll just do it now. I'll just do it now, okay? Hang on. All right, so here we are. I told you race is not a thing, right? Let me show you something. In fact, I didn't fix that here, so let me go here to my other class. Where am I? Oh, let me close that. Okay, I'll just use this to show this to you guys. All right, so this is, I'm going to fix this. The thing in yours is a link, but this is a document that I made on the same topic. So I'll put this in your 6.12. All right, but let me ask you guys some questions about this. All right, this is an overview. This is something that I took from a university cultural anthropology website. Okay, I borrowed this. Okay, but let me make it bigger. I can. Okay, so which of these people in these pictures is Latino, you guys? The one on the left The one in the middle or the one on the right? Debbie says any of them could be. And you say, I guess. You guess, right? How come you guess? How come you're not sure? Because of colonization. Okay. My guess is middle. Okay, thank you, Annie. Maybe right. That's funny. Okay, do you guys agree with Debbie and Annie? Kendall says middle, thank you. Okay. This is the one that most people would identify as Latino. Do you guys agree? Even if you guys are thinking more deeply about it right now. Okay, if you ask somebody to identify which of these people is Latino or Hispanic is the language that this website uses, right there, Hispanic. Okay, but if you ask most people, do you guys agree which one of these people is Latino? They're going to pick the one in the middle. Do you guys agree with that? Yeah. Oh, because of movies. Okay, good job identifying, you know, the media as a source of these ideas we have about race and what it means. Okay, what a Latino person looks like, right? A Latino person looks like this person with this complexion and this color eyes and this texture and color of hair, sometimes darker, sometimes black. Her hair is brown. Okay, but generally she's the picture that we have in our minds when we think about a person, a female person who is Latino. Not so much this person, right? And not so much this person, definitely, probably not this person. Okay, we think of this person as white, don't we? You guys? Red hair, light eyes, very light complexion. But as one of you, I think Debbie said, colonization means that the Spanish got around. The Spanish got around and they traded heavily in slaves. So this guy could be, you know, Brazilian, right? She could be Argentinian or Chilean, right? Or Mexican, right, you guys? Okay, so most of us, and that's what the rest of this stuff says, most of us tend to see each other in these terms: age, economic class, religion, gender, ethnicity, and race, right? These are the physical, visible markers that we make sense of, through which we make sense of other people and their identities. All right, and race is a real big one. Race is a big one. All right, ethnicity refers to a selected cultural and sometimes physical characteristics used to classify people into groups. All right, but culture is about the things that we do, right, you guys? Josh, you were talking about Irish culture. And culture is a set of practices and ways of being, isn't it? What are some aspects of culture, you guys? Food, Debbie says, good. Okay, that's an aspect of culture, of ethnicity. Music, good. Religion, definitely. Samantha says clothing, okay, good. Style, language, good. Language is a big one. Dancing, Kendall says, good. These are all different elements of culture that really anybody can do. Right? But they have become traditional ways of life for people. And those things get heavily identified with race, the thing we think of as race. Right, you guys? Do you guys agree with me that most people in their minds, if they're not thinking about it carefully, conflate, smash in two things into one thing? Okay, race and culture, race and ethnicity. Do you think that they think of those two things as, if not the same, then mutually constitutive? people of a certain race are also going to have a certain culture. Do you think that's true, you guys? Definitely, Annie says, yes. Right, and then we have this thing called cultural appropriation, where the rituals and practices and language and ways of being that people have, right, are closely identified with them because of race. And you're not supposed to borrow those things if you're not of that race, right? And Andy says, but since race doesn't really exist, maybe we think that someone's culture is their race. Okay, yeah, we conflate those things. Race is a made-up concept, it is. And it's clear, Annie and everybody else, right, that we come up with our ideas about what race means. But do you guys agree that most people still think that a person's body has a lot to do with how they are as people? Their physical characteristics have a lot to do with the way that they live their lives? Like their genes, yes, it's in their bodies, okay? Most people think that, okay? Maybe none of us do. Maybe all of us realize that race is not real. It's not biological. Okay, it is real. It has real material effects for people's lives, but it's not real in the way people think it is. It has nothing to do with genetics. Right? This says, for many people, ethnic categorization implies a connection, at least, between biological inheritance and culture. They believe that biological inheritance determines much of cultural identity. So if they don't think of those two things as the same, they think of them as very closely connected, almost necessarily connected. All right, but we know it's not true. Biological race and culture are not the same thing. Cultural traits are learned. All right, so you can drop a white baby, right, into, you know, a culturally ethnic non-white family, right? And that baby will grow up to exhibit the same speech patterns, you know, mannerisms, if that's an aspect of culture, language, you know, tasting food, okay? Different ways of presenting oneself to the world, all right, regardless of their skin color, body shape, or other presumed features. They can be thoroughly enculturated into any culture. Any human being can be, all right? For example, both the women in the photographs above are genetically African, but they don't speak the same language. They don't have any of those things that we just identified as cultural in common. This woman is African American. This woman is Senegalese. They cannot talk to each other, literally, you guys. This woman probably speaks French. Again, because of colonialism. She probably speaks French. But maybe she speaks a native African language. Okay, but probably French. All right. So it gets really deep, and I don't have time to go into all the details. All right, but this is important. A race, the way people usually think of it in terms of, you know, racial categorization, is a biological subspecies or variety of a species consisting of more or less distinct population with anatomical traits, things about their bodies that distinguish it clearly from others. But this biologist definition doesn't fit the reality of human genetic variation. We're 99% genetically identical. Okay, so there's nothing biologically relevant about our ideas about race. Even though effectively race is a real thing, it's not a real thing in the way most people think of it as being a real thing. Okay, that it's in a person's nature to be a way because of how they look. All right, so our stereotypes are not founded on anything concrete. They're all culturally constructed. Does that make sense, you guys? Right, and this is science. Okay, this is not, you know, political viewpoints or anything. This is science. These are facts. So this says it's now clear that our human races, which we'll put in quotes, are primarily cultural creations, not biological realities. right? And those beliefs that we have are based on the false assumption that our traits like skin color, specific facial characteristics, okay, make us who we are. They don't. They don't. And it boils down to natural selection. All of these people have very similar complexions, but they have vastly different cultures. Okay, again, they can't talk to each other. And the reason they look this way is because of their natural environment. All right, so the only thing that's true about these people versus people of European descent is that these people have higher survivability in hot, sunny climates. That's the only thing that's true. Okay, their skin color is going to protect them from UV radiation in ways that white people's won't. All right, otherwise there's no meaningful difference between them. All right, and in the final analysis, it's clear that people, not nature, create our identities. Ethnicity and supposed racial groups are largely cultural and historical constructs. They're social, not biological. Does that make sense, you guys? And I know most of you probably already knew this, all right? But it's good to just bring it back into conscious awareness and ground it there for our future conversations about this stuff. All right, so how does race come to take on the meanings that it does in different cultures, right? And one way, as with gender, we can know that our ideas about race are socially constructed is because not everybody has the same ideas about race. From place to place and culture to culture around the world, people's ideas about race are different. Okay, there are some similarities and overlaps, but here in the US, where again, we're dealing with a lot of diversity, and because we think the color of a person's skin means a whole lot about them, if not everything about them, we have a special problem with understanding race. All right, and it's part of our history. Okay, the reason we understand race the way we do, as I was discussing when we were talking about the Irish, is because of the way this country was founded and the way it developed over time through history. That's a process. Okay, so racialization is another important term that we need to understand for our conversations about these concepts. Right? Racialization means it's something that is done. The ization suffix on there means that race is given a particular meaning through a process. It's not just part of nature. It is constructed. So let me show you this video real quick. We're done at 2, right, you guys? You guys still out there? I'm doing a lot of talking. I don't know if you're still there. I can't see you. Thanks for the thumbs up. Thanks, Tyne. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Katrina. Thanks. Okay, let me show you this video. Let me check my sharing to make sure it's optimized. Okay. Now it is.
The definition I'm going to give, and I want to give attribution where it belongs, is one that comes from a province of Ontario report on the criminal justice system there back in the 80s, I believe. And the way the process works is that we, and again, this has something to do with our cognitive architecture, very easily divide. And in the case of race, it's picking a superficial feature of someone and saying, you folks who have this feature over here, and in the case of race, it's phenotype and structure of craniofacial structure. It is also ancestry. The second step is sorting, so that's separating them. Not just psychologically, but physically, which actually we do in the world. There's segregation, as we know, based on race. Then we start to attribute, qualities to these groups based on anecdote, based on prejudice, based on what's convenient for us. I've noticed that you people over there with the brown skin, seem not as intelligent as the other people. And then in the original formulation from the folks from the province of Ontario, the last is acting on those things and treating people differentially and discriminating based on those attributes. The missing element of that process, it seems to me, regarding race, is essentialization. That the differences we attribute to folks, we say are permanent. Unlike civilizations and societies before roughly the 1500s, 1600s, going into the 1700s, there's no way to change the difference. For example, the Greeks would consider folks who were outside of their culture to be barbarians, you know, folks who couldn't speak the language, who didn't adopt the culture. But if folks decided to adapt those very essential attributes of the culture, they could be Greek, you know. But with race, the answer was no. You are inherently, irretrievably, permanently different.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to play the second one for you. So that was racialization as a process, and this is the history of it.
Race, in my view, comes out of a combination, sort of a confluence of two important things. One is cognitive confusion, and the other is an almost sinister, cynical contrivance of that confusion. So the first part is more or less innocent. You know, we're all prone to cognitive confusion around lots of things. The brain is quite susceptible to seeing things that aren't there and then running with it. And that's part of what happens with race. It takes advantage of our desire and proclivity to dichotomize, to bifurcate, to categorize things. We are very good at this and that, even when there isn't a this and that. Another way to think about it is, and this is particularly useful in thinking about race, is that we very quickly attach deeper meaning to surface distinctions. One of my favorite ways of illustrating that is this. So most people, almost to the person actually, when shown this and asked which two substances are most alike, will immediately say the two substances that are the same color. And that, it seems very defensible in some ways. When told, however, you know, that actually it's the brown substance and one of the white substances that are alike, then the correction gets made. And people say, oh, I bet I know why that is. And I say, well, why is that? I bet one of them is sugar, and the other is brown sugar, and the other is salt, which is actually the case. And we know that the only difference between brown sugar and white sugar is that molasses was removed from one to make it look a little bit different and taste just a little bit different. But they are elementally alike, whereas white sugar and salt are different in almost every way, molecularly, in terms of where they come from, in terms of how we use them, etc. This is what happens with race. People at a certain time in our history, 1600s into the 1700s through the 1800s, started to be captivated by the idea that surface distinctions between people meant something deeper than just the surface. What happened that was very unfortunate is that that ascendancy of thinking in that way about all things, including human beings, got coupled up with a very desperate desire on the part of the pioneers of what was to be America to justify an inconsistency in the way they were going about their business. Because on the one hand, the folks who were the pioneers really wanted to believe in a principle of equality between all people. On the other hand, they were treating some people who certainly looked like people in very many ways in a very unequal way, in a savagely unequal way. The idea of race that was growing up at that same time supplied a very wonderful strategy and rationale for continuing to treat people in an unequal way in a society that was to be based on inequality.
All righty. Okay. Let me see. Let me stop sharing my screen with you now. Okay. So did you guys understand what the professor was saying? You may want to watch those again, right? He's very erudite and uses a lot of high value Scrabble words in his explanation of these concepts. Okay, but generally, he was talking about the process of racialization, right? As having steps that start with selecting. And we all do this. We have to. All right. This is human nature, you guys. Implicit bias, stereotyping, all of this is in our nature to do. Okay. It's part of our survival mechanism to do this. And threat assessment is part of that. Which person is or is not the threat? And we'll talk about that some more next week when we talk about racial profiling. All right, but first we select and then we separate, right? And we do this with all kinds of things, not just people, but with all kinds of things. And then we attribute, right? We make attributions. Once we've selected and separated, we say, okay, that group of things is all about this. And this other group of things is all about that different thing, right? And then we act on those beliefs that we have, okay, that we have arrived at through this process of racialization. And when we're selecting, separating, and attributing on the basis of race, and then we act on those attributions, on the stereotypes, on the implicit biases that we have about people because of their race, that can lead to unequal treatment, all right? Which in our culture is a problem. Not in every culture, but in our culture. Because then the professor talks about history, right? He talks about essentialism too. That's another important term for you guys to understand, essentialism. And he says the belief that these differences that we observe are permanent and natural, that they're biological. And as we just discussed, that's not the case with race. There's nothing permanent, okay, or natural about the attributions that we make to someone on the basis of race, our ideas about what that means. Okay, people are not locked into the stereotypes that we all have about race. They're capable of doing and being whatever they want, just like with gender, right? Right, and then he talks about history, like I said. He said at one point, our ideas about race were not what they are now, okay? You could be Greek regardless of your race. As long as you assimilated into that culture, you were accepted as Greek, regardless of what color you were or what physical features you had, aside from color. And then he talks about cognitive confusion, excuse me, right? Which we are all desperately, constantly trying to resolve. And again, this is human nature. We're trying to make sense of the world around us. We don't like being confused. We like knowing, okay, what we're dealing with. So that's why we do the sorting, separating, and attribution. So we know what we're dealing with. That's why we rely on stereotypes, okay? Because we think we know what we're dealing with if we're relying on stereotypes. But we're constantly trying to resolve that confusion. And we rely really heavily on the evidence of our eyes to do that, okay? To do the process of racialization and then resolve that cognitive confusion. He talked about in the 1600s in this country, and this is the history I was alluding to earlier, it was necessary for the founders of this country, the people who were involved in that project, building the idea of America, right? To justify the enslavement of certain people in the context of an ideology that valorized freedom and justice for all and equality. Right? That's very familiar to everybody in this meeting, those ideals, okay, with liberty and justice for all and equality. Okay, we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, are words that you guys are familiar with. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, except not everybody, right? And so how do you justify that? Oh, those people are different because of how they look. Right? And again, I'm probably recapping this for a lot of you who already know this history, but just to understand the concept of race and how we came to understand it as a thing, the way that most people understand it now, and that it's not a real thing at all in the way most people understand it, and in the way most people act upon that misunderstanding. Does that make sense, you guys? I hope so, because I got to let you go. It's 2. Thank you, Katrina. Okay, all right, and we're going to keep talking about this, and we'll talk more. I know we didn't talk about Kofer, Ortiz, Kofer, and Gup today, but we'll talk about all of them next week. All right, and we'll use all of these concepts that we've been discussing to unpack those texts. All right, so before I meet with you next week, you probably want to review Ortiz, Kofer, and Gup so we can talk about stereotypes, and then read and analyze Kennedy and Rahab so we can talk about racial profiling. All righty? We'll let you go. Have a good one.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.